This bill is really monumental in that it acknowledges past harm, it atones for it, and it actually provides restitution in real concrete ways for impacted people directly and for impacted communities.
These communities actually will be able to be prioritized to be able to be part of the new burgeoning cannabis industry.
Pretty much throughout its entire existence as a policy, we know that it was never really about the science of the plant. It was never about cannabis itself, but much more so about prohibition being a tool to be able to target communities.
So it became a political tool of oppression as well as racism as the undertone for why you ended up creating prohibition to begin with, which was to benefit some very wealthy, individuals at the expense of whole populations of people that have been criminalized just for being of color.
Given the scale of harm that's been done in New York State, where we've had more than 800,000 arrests for low-level cannabis possession in the last 25 years alone, and the vast majority of those arrests were Black and Latinx New Yorkers. And this is not because there's different use patterns. People use cannabis, people sell cannabis at pretty much the same rate across different racial groups, across different parts of the state. And yet, time and time again, the enforcement is laser focused on communities of color and low income communities. Where there's higher marijuana arrests, there tends to be much higher economic vulnerability. And also those tend to be communities of color because of the way that criminalization has been focused. The lifelong consequences that people face because of cannabis prohibition really go well beyond being hauled into a precinct and put through the arrest process, which is, traumatic enough in and of itself. Families were absolutely torn apart. Mothers who had just given birth had babies literally ripped from their arms days after their child was born, just over allegations. And then we see again how people were blocked out from being able to access, stable housing because of a cannabis allegation again, or a low-level conviction, how people were not able to pursue higher education because of prior cannabis criminal legal contact.
With a conviction, it affects your ability to take out a loan. It affects a landlord-tenant review. Your job prospects get immediately limited. And if you had been in school and you were receiving college funding through federal grant monies, Pell Grants or whatever, that can be stripped. That doesn't happen with drunk driving. That doesn't happen with sexual assault. That doesn't happen with drunk driving leading to an accident and a fatality that leads to a sexual assault later that evening. Kids still have no issues with their education. So the reversal of fortune here is tremendous as to what it means to these communities, because they can finally rebuild. And since they are now earmarked under New York State, 40% of the revenue after the costs of administering the program are taken care of, 40% of that revenue goes to community reinvestment, 40% then goes to education, and 20% is going into other sort of wellness programs, including drug rehab. So it's a literal commitment to a rebuild of the communities that had been decimated by prosecution without good reason.
When the bill was signed, expungements can start. There will be a 2-year process in which automatically people who have had a prior marijuana conviction will have that expunged. This bill that is passed through now devotes 40% of the tax revenue that will come into New York State specifically for communities that have been the hardest hit by prior criminalization. The bill sets out a goal in terms of cannabis business licenses of having 50% of those people participating in the industry be social equity licensees. And that means somebody who themselves has been directly impacted by criminalization or is a family member or is from a community that has been disproportionately harmed. People will be able to build a much better understanding. We'll be able to talk with young people in a much more frank and open way about, what are the things that they should take into account, maybe delay when they start using cannabis, but not to fearmonger them anymore, but rather to give them information, to give young people critical thinking skills, to be able to unpack for them what's going on in a much more sound and much more evidence-based way. So really excited to be turning the page into a new era of marijuana justice here in New York.